Following presentation is presented commercial-free by the Texas Latino Conservatives. The views and opinions expressed in the following program do not represent those of ESPN 97.5, Gow Media, or their sponsors and partners.
All right, good afternoon. My name is Orlando Sanchez. I'm the founder of the Texas Latino Conservatives. It is a statewide political action committee. And we have a concomitant nonprofit organization. It's a 501c4 where we educate, motivate, and encourage everybody in Texas, but particularly Latinos, to participate in the political process. And having said that, I decided to come on the air with a couple of colleagues, former colleagues and dear friends of mine now. As you may recall, I was a former Houston City Council member during 1995 through 2001. I ran for mayor of the city on two occasions, back in 2001 against incumbent Mayor Lee Brown. And then I ran for mayor again in 2003 against Bill White. I have served as Harris County Treasurer for 12 years. And so now I'm taking a break, but I do stay in touch with my former colleagues on the Houston City Council. And I have two of them actually here. One was a former council member, Michael Yarbrough. Michael is committed to assisting communities with ever-changing and emerging challenges. He has a passion for helping communities succeed and grow by adding new strategies. He's a tenacious and unflinching advocate for diversity initiatives. He led sweeping changes during his term as a city councilman, and during his term period, he developed an unwavering drive and commitment to getting it done through relationships, building, and hard work. We're also joined by his former chief of staff, Richard Johnson. Now we call him Dr. Richard Johnson. He's the director of the Texas Public Policy Foundation's Booker T. Washington Initiative, which examines the effect of public policy on African American communities. Previously, Johnson served as chief of staff both at the municipal level and state governments. As chief of staff for Houston City Council member Michael Yarbrough, he played a significant role in drafting and navigating policies related to public safety, public works, housing, and community development. During the 85th and 86th legislative sessions in Texas, he served as chief of staff, as a senior policy analyst for House member, and worked on education, public policy, healthcare, and workforce development legislation. And joining us finally from Dallas, Texas, is my dear friend Tom Pauken. He's a former member and chairman of the Texas Workforce Commission, a former long-term resident of Dallas who now resides in the community known as Port Aransas in Nueces County on the Texas Gulf Coast. Pauken is a businessman, a lawyer, and the author of two books. He served as chairman of the Texas Republican Party from 1994 to 1997. During the transition period when the party leaped quickly from minority to majority status at statewide level. A staunch conservative, Pauken has also served with President Ronald Reagan in the White House. And on August 21st, 2006, Rick Perry, former governor, appointed Pauken chairman of the Texas Task Force on Appraisal Reform to study and make recommendations on how to address Texas's continuing concerns over property appraisals. So that's it for the bios of our guests this evening. The reason we're here is because everybody is talking about what happened a couple of weeks ago with George Floyd. We don't want to talk about it. We've had a lot of conversations. I immigrated to this country in the 1960s in the heat of the civil rights movement. And so we've talked for a long time. Hopefully what we can do tonight is have a couple of takeaways, have a conversation. Not everybody at this table is a conservative. I am. I know certainly Mr. Pauken is. I'll let Michael Yarbrough, my former city council colleague, speak for himself, and I'll let Dr. Richard Johnson speak for himself. But that's the purpose of this. Michael, I want to turn it over to you and let you welcome the listeners. I also want to give a call-in number. Tonight, if you have questions or comments, we'd love to hear from you. Area code 713-780-3776, 713-780-3776. I'll repeat it. Michael, how are you doing this evening?
I'm doing great. How about yourself?
I'm doing better now that I see you.
I have that effect on people.
I hear that. So, Michael, you and I have known each other probably going on about a quarter century right now, coming up on 25 years. You and I served on the Houston City Council. We were both considered minority candidates and office holders. I was an at-large member. You represented District B, which is predominantly African American. Is that correct?
That's true.
And we had a lot of conversations way back when. I tell people all the time, Michael and I have never voted together, right? When I'd vote yes, he'd vote no. And when Michael voted yes, I'd vote no.
That's because she was always wrong.
But back in those days, we had a lot of conversations about affirmative action because a lot of the African-American community felt they weren't getting their fair share of contracts. Is that correct, Michael?
That's correct.
And so that's kind of how we developed our relationship. And Michael, you're a longtime resident of Houston, right? You went to Wheatley High School?
Phyllis Wheatley.
Phyllis Wheatley High School. And give us your impression. What's going on? What's the talk in the African-American community this evening?
Well, I think the talk is that people realize and recognize that there needs to be change. I don't know if they know how to really go about it, because what I see is a transfer of power. And I would say, while we're going through this pandemic, the biggest pandemic in the African American community is the political pandemic among our African American leadership. And that because the community, and rather voicing what it needs, the elected officials come out and tell us what we should get. And I think that when that dialogue began to change, and that's what I call a transfer of power, because we elect them and they work for us.
Does that lead to frustration? Does that lead to pent-up frustration? I mean, you say people, the power tells you what to do, what you need. You guys, the African-American community, doesn't get to tell the leadership what it wants and what it needs.
I think it leads to frustration when you're approached and people say, hey, and they complain about what they see or what they're going through. And they have the power to change that. So that's where the frustration come in when they approach me and ask me, what can we do? Your power is in your vote.
You and I are about the same age. Are things gotten better in Houston, or are they been static?
I would say it's probably 50-50. There's some things that have changed, have gotten better, but then there's some things that have stayed the same.
What are some of the things that have improved in terms of race relations for the African-American community in Houston?
Well, you had an opportunity that you see more African-Americans and Hispanics involved in politics. But still you're faced with some of those same issues that plagues the community as it relates to education, as it relates to jobs. So those are some of the continuing things that you face. We continue to talk about it every year, and the only thing that changes is the statistics. They most likely continue to go up.
You mentioned education. Richard, I'm going to turn to you. I know you have a passion for education. You have earned your PhD at Texas Southern University, right, after we all left Houston City Council. One of the things that's really bothered me, and I held a press conference December 18 in front of the Houston Independent School District asking for the state of education agency to come in and help the parents and the teachers and the students at HISD. We have a number of schools that have been failing. Is the public education system better or worse? Is it static? What is it, and how is it affecting our children of color, our African American communities?
It's worse. It's worse, Orlando. It's not better. I mean, it was better back when I was in school in the 70s. It was better back when you guys were in school, probably in the 60s.
Yep. A little older.
Well, one of the things is because if you remember back then, we didn't have the school to prison pipeline. The school to prison pipeline has come about over the last 20 years. And so, to answer your question, the public school system has gotten worse. And I supported you, when you came out that day, and a lot of folks in the community basically really don't understand, because they don't have all the data, and the perception is not out there that the school systems are failing our kids, and it's not prolific in their face, and the media doesn't put it out there in their face. So there's a situation where the unions, the teachers unions, will say, hey, any alternative to this school to prison pipeline or to this dropout factory, which is a school that we used to have as some of our premier schools. And so basically they'll say, well, look, these guys are trying to take money from public schools, but the real deal is we're trying to open the gate and say, well, look, here's an opportunity to go to a good school. I am pro good school. Now, I am anti bad school, particularly if a bad school is perpetually bad, simply because in 1979, when I graduated, the state of Texas had 17 state prisons. By the year 2000, it had 137 state prisons. And so we went from 17 to 137. So a failing school system contributed to a thriving criminal justice
What
system.
is the population of the Texas prison population with respect to ethnicity and race? Do you know those numbers?
Right now, I can give you some rough estimates. Rough estimates about close to 200,000.
Total population.
Yeah, close to 200,000. And then there's about 47 to 48% African American, and then close to 40% Hispanic, then the rest of it.
Wow, almost half. Tom, up in Dallas, thank you for joining us. Tom, thank you for taking time out of your Sunday. I wanted to, because you headed up the Texas Workforce Commission, and Michael Yarbrough, my former city council colleague, just talked about work, and then Richard talks about education. Is there a correlation? This is a complaint I hear a lot from my African American friends. The pipeline to prison. Is it because there's a lack of opportunity, a lack of entrepreneurship in the African American community? Is it a lack of education? I mean, you've seen this. What is your perspective?
Well, first of all, there formerly was a strong black entrepreneurship in this state and in our city of Dallas. I know it's not there as much anymore. When I was chairman of the Texas Workforce Commission, we emphasized the need, instead of pushing everybody to a university, to give them the option of having a vocational and technical education, developing skills that are easily translatable into jobs. And you mentioned earlier, I think Dr. Johnson heads up the Booker T. Washington Institute of the Texas Public Policy Foundation. This is a forgotten man. And I was involved in 1971 in making being with a group of people that made a documentary film for Tuskegee Institute. And I was so impressed with what Booker T. Washington and George Washington Carver had done in a segregated state at the time, Alabama. They had the largest, it ultimately became the largest post-secondary school institution in the state of Alabama. And the students built that place brick by brick themselves, and there was an emphasis on people being self-sufficient and self-reliant. And it was George Washington Carver, they were particularly the small farmers in rural Alabama, a tremendous number of black farmers that were turned out. The vet medicine school, which is one of the finest institutions in the country, they had many white students trying to get into the vet medicine school down there. Dr. Bowie headed it up at the time. We had a situation, and we've seen films on this, the Tuskegee Airmen, and what they did. And those were in much more difficult times in a segregated society, but there was the principle of self-reliance, trying to, a helping hand, help you rise above where you were. And at the same time, there was, I think, stronger family ties, which have been decimated, as Dan Moynihan wrote about what happened with the decline of the family, and particularly harmful in the black community, which was fueled in a way by taking away the principal responsibility and control over the money of the man in the household, in the black community. And I think all of these things combined suggest we've got a culture in trouble across all racial lines, and yet it is particularly afflicted the black community. And I do think that it is critical that we give young people, and we tried to do that with the Workforce Commission, give them in high school an opportunity to develop a skill and a talent. They can't take that away from you. And those are jobs, good-paying jobs, welders, electricians, plumbers that are available. And there needs to be more emphasis on workforce training, it seems to me, than assuming everybody go to college, you get some general education degree or something, and you get a lot of debt and hard to get a job when you get out of school.
Right. Well, interesting perspectives from everybody. I want to talk a little bit, shift gears to the media. By the way, if you're interested in calling and have a question for our guest, Tom Pauken in Dallas, Dr. Richard Johnson here in Houston, or former city council member Michael Yarbrough, we're talking about race relations all over the state of Texas, but we are here in Houston. We're streaming live on ESPN Radio on 97.5. You can call in at 713-780-3776, 713-780-3776. One of the interesting things that I've noticed during in the aftermath of George Floyd's homicide, or alleged homicide, is that the constant 24-hour back-to-back, 7-day-a-week coverage of the looters and the rioters, right? I've always said that the media, the American media, is relishing in this, and because I think that perhaps I'm wondering if that's how they not want American population, the citizenry in general, to see the black man. What's your perspective, Michael? I mean, do you think the coverage is too much focused on people that are generally not from the community, that are disruptors, because 99.9% of the community is working, going to church, and spending time with their family and doing what every other American does?
Well, I'm not going to say that it's not needed. And I think you can say that sometime, and then it's been infiltrated by those who outside of those protests, or people who are not there for the protest. But I think the protest is very much needed, and I'll tell you why. I think now peaceful protest, but I think the protest is needed because it will be a reminder that we still have a problem. And I say that is because it leads to people coming in and helping with that problem across the board. It reminds me of when Harvey came. After Harvey was over, it still had boots on the ground to go to those people who was affected by Harvey. And so I look at that. So the people who was affected, and because of George Floyd's death, then the conversation about police brutality, but more than that, it was about racism. And so now the conversation of us, for the first time, I believe, a real serious conversation.
Yeah, but I think you missed my point on the comment and the question that I have. Is the back-to-back, 7-day-a-week, 24-hour-a-day coverage of the violence a bad image to portray on American TV sets every night, 7 days a week?
I think it's okay to portray the image, but if you remove the violence, the image has to stay there because you don't want the conversation to go away. Okay. You're talking about the violence. Who's perpetuating the violence? And so if you remove the violence from there, but the message can't get lost, and the media will soon go away anyway.
Richard?
Well, Landon, I'm going to throw something at you guys. Tom, you stole my thunder, man. I'm the Booker T. Washington guy, so you kind of stole my thunder there, CT, career technology education, vocational education, that sort of thing, because that's, in self-reliance, that's what we promote. But I'm going to tell you this, and it's going to shake you a little bit. I think race relations have gotten better in America, but I think conditions in the black community have gotten worse.
Wow.
Now
I agree.
You got to play with that a little bit, because my son is he's the kind of guy, 20 years old. His friends are Hispanic, white, Indian, every different race. As a matter of fact, he's a gamer, so he's studying game design. So they're all in one room, and he's doing games with people in Africa. He's doing games with people in Mexico, and you have somebody in that same room from Brazil. So the world technology has brought them together, but the conditions in the black community have gotten worse. The breakdown of the family, economic development and stimulation, inequalities, entrepreneurship has been removed. And back to Tom's point, when we took vocational education out of the high schools, and then put the idea out that everybody should go and get a bachelor's, a master's, or a doctorate degree, then our dropout rate went from like 0.01 to almost 50%, because it was never designed that way for everybody to go and get a college degree. Education was designed to create a healthy and well-informed workforce for America, period. Whether that's in a hospital or a construction site, welding site, plumbing, period. And when we took that away and said, if you don't get a bachelor's degree, master's degree, doctorate degree, you're not successful, and put that in the minds of kids, then we had a high dropout rate. They dropped out of school and dropped into criminal justice. They left a vacuum there for criminal activity to happen.
Tom, I know that you wanted to chime in on that because I think you agree with Richard, but my original question is the American media a friend of the African American community? Are they doing them justice by this constant showing of the violence, or is this just a fact of today's media? I mean, and there's no harm intended.
I don't think they're doing anybody a favor in this country, but I think this is really a class problem. Right now it appears to be a racial conflict, but it really is a class, because you've got a political elite and you've got a financial elite. We have moved from an industrial economy where there were good middle-class jobs, and we shipped our jobs overseas, and we've got to bring our manufacturing base home.
Right.
And those were good-paying middle-class jobs where working people, black, white, Hispanic, could get good-paying jobs and support a family. Most of those have gone by the wayside. And you've got this a financial Wall Street-driven economy, and they're living in their gated communities. They don't, they can say all the right things, quote unquote, but they have no real connection with the black community. I work with. I saw Bob Whitson on a show the other night. We worked with Bob when I was director of the Action Agency back for President Reagan, which encouraged. He had a great program to encourage community development, economic development in low-income areas. And Jack Kemp did a lot of good in terms of trying to encourage at HUD home ownership for minorities. And I think that's critical, to own your own home, own your own small business. And all of that, we've lost a lot of that. And so I think it's a lot deeper than just a race divide. I think it's a class, or the elite has lost touch with the average American, and it's lost touch with the working whites as well as the black community. And so that is it's a deeper problem than just that. And secondly, as Richard just said, the comment about the culture is going in the wrong direction. You've got to have stable families.
Right.
And in the old days, I just saw the documentary on Clarence Thomas the other day, and it featured his grandfather who raised him, and how Clarence got radicalized when he was at college up at Holy Cross during the late 60s. And I remember that radical period. And and yet his grandfather was real unhappy about it. But he again taught self-reliance, and he ultimately, Clarence Thomas, turned back in the direction that his grandfather had taught him. And he had a father that I guess had abandoned the family, but the grandfather was there. And I think this is what we forget, that all of these ties of family, neighborhood, they helped one another. We had a foster grandparent program where these black elderly women would take care of these young girls who were with little babies that had nobody to help them. But there they were, serving as a family surrogate. And a lot of this is these little things that make a difference, a big difference in individual people's lives, and they're missing now.
Michael, you spent a lot of time in District B of Houston, which is up around the Fifth Ward area, and I know your passion for education as well. You've worked with a lot of charter schools. I don't want to make this a conservative or a liberal program, Republican versus Democrat, although we have both sides of the aisle represented here and probably a nonpartisan as well.
I'm conservative when it comes to certain things. I'm liberal when it comes to certain things. I'm conservative when you don't. I'm liberal when it comes to getting money. I'm conservative when it comes to giving out money.
keeping it. That's good.
All right. Before I turn back to you, Michael, if you want to call and ask a question of Tom Pauken up in Dallas, Richard Johnson, former city council member Michael Yarbrough, you may do so by dialing 713-780-3776, 713-780-3776. I hope we're live streaming on Facebook as well. I'm not sure, but if you want to drop us a message there, you can do that as well. Michael, everybody was talking about the family. Is there a palpable deterioration of the African American family unit?
Well, and I don't want to make it seem, and I hear what Tom is saying, but it's not as shallow as that. It's like when I talk to people and tell them the difference between Jacques Cousteau discovered a whole new world underneath of that water because treasures are sunken; they don't float. And so sometimes when you see the deterioration of the man not being in the picture of the family, it's just not that. What was the cause of that? See, we never talk about the cause of that. We just talk about the results of it, But that was a cause of that, especially during the crime bill, the 3-strike rule. When crack cocaine came into, so that's a cause to that. But at the same time,
Wasn't that Joe Biden?
Hey, look here, there's a lot of those Democrats because he just didn't. There was some that voted on that too. But the fact of the matter is that there's a root cause to that because we can't forget that there have also been single parents long before that happened. We had strong women. We had strong neighborhoods because we looked out for each other. Richard and I come from a community where people looked out for each other. Now the mentality has changed because I often hear this word snitching. I said, and you get, when I was coming up, they used to talk about what the people on the West Side had. I said, well, if you want what the people have on the West Side, then you must do what they do. See, when someone is breaking and entering, they call the police. That's not considering snitching. But they have all these sayings, and it's even into the elementary school. So then it's perpetual, like Richard talked about, perpetuality. It's perpetual because now, hey, I can't be snitched. So I take this with me, and you tell the next generation, hey, snitches get stitches and end up in ditches. I hadn't heard that.
Right.
So it's not as shallow as that. We must get to the root of the problem. But there's a lot of, until we really start the conversation, and really because we've crossed these lines, you need to know about my ills, my pains, and I need to know about your ills and your pains. And we really need to have a real conversation about that. Because when I look at a lot of things that when we talk about laws and policies, those are people that we elect who are listening to the community. When are you coming to the community to really find out how that policy has an impact on the community that you're passing this law? And a lot of times laws and policies we know are driven by lobbyists. major corporations. Tom is absolutely correct when you talk about all of these people.
Wall
with
Street.
Wall Street, all this money, and they live behind the gated community. But they haven't came out. And I say, in the black community, we have to change our mindset. We have a mind settle. We settle for certain things. So we have to really change our mindset.
If you want to participate, please call in 713-780-3776, 713-780-3776. We're happy to entertain your questions, listen to your comments. We'd like to hear your perspective. Tom, I'm wondering if, I've heard the word intractable problem. Is the problem intractable? Are we at a point of no return in this country, or is there hope for us?
Well, I'm generally an optimist, but I'm becoming increasingly pessimistic, and it's a combination of factors. It's the economic. There is greater inequality than there was in the 50s and 60s and 70s because what we're seeing is the destruction of the middle class and a working middle class. Secondly, there is a culture that has collapsing around us. And I think you've got to have the underpinnings of a Christian faith, a Judeo-Christian ethic that guides your behavior and our personal responsibility and all of that. It's sort of like I've got mine, and and it's kind of every man for himself. The councilman just said a little while ago, the neighborhood there was strong neighborhood support, and that's really true. When I was a young attorney, there was this great teacher, a black lady by the name of Judy Lott in Dallas, and she took on the white superintendent, and but she cared about her kids and getting an education, and boy, she was tough on those kids. But he moved her into this sort of most, by the common use of the word, the most racist area in Dallas at the time. It was called Pleasant Grove. And after a while, the white parents were all on her side because it was more than just about race. They could tell this was a teacher who cared about their kids and was trying to get them a good education. Whereas a superintendent, he didn't care. And he was moving good black principals out of their neighborhoods into other areas when we had the forced busing, and good black teachers into predominantly non-black schools, and it was chaos. And I think it spiraled downward from there, and it's just it's unfortunate. But can it be turned around? I don't know. I don't see any good political leadership on either side. On the Republican or Democratic side.
Yeah.
And I worked for Reagan. I got to know Eisenhower, both of whom I think were great presidents and outstanding leaders. But I just don't see it today.
All right. Well, we got a call from Linda. Linda, what's your question or comment?
Well, I have a question. I hear you talking about it has more to do with race, and you're saying that it has to do with class. There's racism, that's the bottom line. It's all about one class think they're better than the other. But I want to know about the cop that killed Floyd. What kind of class did he come from? What kind of class did you categorize him? That's what I want to know. That's it.
Okay. Thank you, Linda. Appreciate you tuning in. I don't know that we can speak for the type of individual the officer was that decided to put his knee on Mr. Floyd's throat. That's a tough one. I'm not going to attempt to tell you what class he came from. I mean, for all I know, he might have been upper middle class, lower middle class, But Linda brings up a good point because Richard and I were talking about this. Richard is trained in psychotherapist, and one of the things we were talking about, Linda, is our police officers routinely checked for their mental health status. You remember a few years ago there was an aircraft that plunged into the Swiss Alps, I think, because the pilot had mental health issues. Right? He locked himself in the cabin and took the 777 aircraft into the mountains, and all the people on board and the crew perished. Airlines started doing mental health evaluations of the men and women in the cockpit. Well, our cockpit are the black and white squad cars with the two folks in there with the heavy armaments, and we give them the law to enforce on our behalf. Every community gives these men and women, and I'm telling you, it's a tough job. But the question, Richard, is, are we looking out for their mental health?
And the answer to that question is about 10%. And about 90% no, and so we Jarvis Johnson brought forward a bill in the 85th legislative session to, number one, do initial psychological screenings and then do follow-up psychological screenings periodically with police officers. When we look at something that happened with Mr. Floyd and with others, because right on my street, right across the street from me where I grew up, Alva Charles London was killed by HPD, and he was shot 8 times when he was down on the ground. And this is when I was about 15 years old. So this is nothing new, but here's what we have discovered. And that is, number one, there are some folks who come through the cracks in the police department, come through the cracks in the system in the police department that have psychological problems. And when they put on the uniform, they put on a uniform and they put it on top of those psychological issues that they have. That's not 98% of them. That's about 2%. And then when we see the behavior come out of them, we say this person is what? Crazy. They couldn't be normal or thinking like the reasonable individual. And then on the other tier of that is we have people who come in perfectly mentally healthy, but after being in the force 5 or 6 years have seen things in the combat zone that they had never seen before in their lives.
Post-traumatic stress.
And now, but there is no follow-up.
Yeah.
I've had police officers, the retired police officers, tell me I took one exam and then I served 31 years and never got another exam.
Tom, is that an issue in your opinion? You've served in many categories as a public policy expert for many leaders, both governors and presidents, and you've headed up commissions. But I mean, are police officers in need of evaluation?
Yeah, let me give you an analogy, and I saw it firsthand. I served in Vietnam. I enlisted in the Army and was a lieutenant over there. But
we got a lot in common, Tom. I was in the military as well.
Well, you know that they were running through OCS trying to get any officer they could, and they got a lot of officers who were unsuited to lead people into battle. And we had a Lieutenant Calley who was an exception to the rule, but he was an exception who. Did terrible things over there. But he was unsuited for that job. And I saw going through basic training, young 19-year-old OCS lieutenants. I'm a regular Army 23-year-old regular Army.
Mm-hmm.
I'd enlisted and then later got a commission. But I see these 19-year-old lieutenants who were unsuited for leadership. And it's just like I used to use the term, they gave that guy a gun and a badge, and he was ill-suited to be a sheriff a deputy sheriff or a police officer. And they're just people that needed to be weeded out. I've been told, I have a good friend who also served in Vietnam who was up in Minneapolis and said that middle management at the Minneapolis Police Department, and those are kind of your first sergeants in the Army equivalent, is very poor, and that's where you get an example from of what's right, what's wrong, what you do, and what's not accepted. And so this is a real problem. But I think I think a lot of you see a lot of police officers quit who are probably many good officers are quitting. They're fed up. So everybody's tarnished with this bad brush, and there are a few that have it's obviously mistakes are made and it's terrible, but you deal with them appropriately, and then you have to figure out what are the lessons learned and move on.
And Tom, talking about middle management, you have to address that because he is a police officer who had, I think, about 19 different citations. And so,
and a 19-year veteran.
Yeah. So, come on. Is that the power of the police union?
Yep. So I'm assuming we're all agreeing that perhaps, like the airline industry, frequent evaluation of the mental health, checking for post-traumatic stress. Police officers, first of all, we have to recognize this is not an easy job. These are not six-figure salaries for, line officers. They have families, they have stresses, they have financial problems. Some may have marital problems. Some have parents that are ill, like any other human, they all have problems. And sometimes if those problems aren't addressed and evaluated, unfortunately, they may take them out into the street. So I suspect that we all agree that frequent or occasional mental health evaluations is probably a good change in police departments.
Not occasional.
And let me just
Frequent.
say, and let me just add to that, because on the front end, the initial evaluation is incredibly important. Right. Because there are some folks who make it in on the force who never should have been there. And one of the things that happen is they make it bad for all the good police officers who are there. They're the ones who tarnish the brand because they got in with a mental health problem. And we didn't discover, the system didn't discover it on the front end. Now, once you do make it past the initial psychological evaluation, then there has to be periodic evaluations to make sure that you're maintaining your mental health while you're in because of post-traumatic stress disorder.
All right, if you want to participate, if you have a question or a comment of Michael Yarbrough, former city councilman, District B, which represents predominantly the African-American community, the historic 5th Ward of Houston, Dr. Richard Johnson, a U.S. Army veteran, and he heads up the Booker T. Washington Institute over at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, or our dear friend Tom Pauken in Dallas, Texas, former chairman of the Republican Party, head of the Texas Workforce Commission, worked under the President Reagan and Governor Perry. Please call us at 713-780-3776, 713-780-3776. Michael, we're going to be down to our last 15 minutes here in just a second or two. And we were having a conversation before we went on the air, that we didn't want this to be just another conversation about race relations in the city of Houston and the state of Texas. We called the program a call to action. Do you have one or two concrete ideas that we all together, and I'm going to share mine with you. I made a concerted effort some time ago.
I have my two, so I'll wait till later.
Okay, all right. Tom, years ago, I decided, I just decided that I was not going to look at my fellow American as a Hispanic, as an Asian, as an Indian, as a gay, as a black man, as a black woman, or anything else. I was going to look at everybody as my fellow American, and that certainly has helped me out a lot. And I try to do that every day. I don't distinguish between male and female. I try to treat everybody exactly the same way. Michael, what are your thoughts, and what are one or two things we can do to improve the situation for our communities?
And if everyone was like you, that would be great. But or someone else don't go through the same things. So, but the way you look at that, that's great.
But let me ask you a question. I raised my daughter never to address somebody by the color of their skin or their there goes a German, or there goes a Canadian, or there goes a Mexican, or a Cuban, or there goes a black man, or it's always a human being, always an American. That's how, are we doing better, guys, in terms of raising our kids to look at each other as a fellow human being?
Well, let me tell you once again. I don't want to do on the surface. Even if I see a Canadian or a German, there's something that I probably need to know about them that I can learn. So I need to recognize that, hey, that's a German. Hey, tell me something about your culture that I may not know. Let me appreciate what you're doing. So I don't want to ignore what I see, or what they are.
Yeah, but I'm saying in terms of forming biases in your mind. You know what I'm saying?
I agree with you, but biases will always be there.
All right. What are your ideas? What are your suggestions?
Well, I think internally,
what's your call to action tonight?
I think the black community has to go inside itself and start recognizing that, hey, everything starts at home. What have I been ignoring for the last 25, 35, 50 years? What can we do? And once again, I stated at the onset is that, hey, look here, we transfer our power to our elected officials because we think our elected officials should be doing and looking out for us, and that's not always the case. Rich and I talk about this. I'm tired of bringing free bicycles, free food. It's the old saying. Teach a person to fish, and you give them a fish sandwich, you fed them for a day. Teach them to fish, and you feed them for a lifetime. So we need to teach people how to fish instead of just bringing the fish sandwich by. And so, if anything, and I'm expressing that to the community leaders that I'm talking about, because as one person that was a Democrat, Ann Richards, used to say, all politics is local. So in the community is where it starts and it spreads out. It don't start out and come in. It starts inward.
Okay. 713-780-3776, 713-780-3776. If you want to call, have your voice heard, offer your opinion or comment, or even ask a question. Richard, what is your call to action this evening? What are your ideas?
My number one call to action is going to be, if you're out there listening, I want you to reach out to State Representative Jarvis Johnson. I want you to support the police reform bill that requires psychological evaluations at the onset and also psychological evaluations periodically for police officers and firemen. And then the second piece is, if you're out there and you're listening, for all the brothers out there, all the black men out there, don't let the media define you. Because what the media does is they show all these pictures of stuff blowing up, and then they say it's all in the name of our brother Floyd. But his family said that's not what we're about. We don't set churches on fire. We don't do those sorts of things. Look at the people who are really doing those things and then say, look, you get away from me, because what it is, you trying to riot, I'm trying to protest, which is two different things. Then the last call to action that I have is we have to bring the faith community into our protest. We have to bring the faith community into our endeavor, because whenever we leave God out of the equation, we've left the main ingredient out. That has been the link between every protest that we've had, every movement that we've had. We've always had the faith community involved in that movement, significantly involved in that movement, and that's what changes the hearts of people. So if we can bring God into our movement, into our protest, I think that we will get to the place that we need to be. Support righteous and morally sound legislation that's going to not only help police officers, but it's going to help the community, because we're going to stop folks from getting into the police department who should not be there. And then the last thing is, don't let the media define you.
Right. Tom, before I get into your takeaways and what you have to offer this evening and your thoughts, I wanted to ask you a question. I've been meaning to ask you this question. Conservatives, Republicans have been in charge of this state now for about 25 years. And my question is, are the conservatives walking away from public education, or are they just throwing their hands up in urban areas with respect to big school districts like the Houston Independent School Districts and say, that's it? because that's a complaint I hear, is that, the Austin conservatives are walking away from urban education. We started off this program almost 40 minutes ago, and the first thing that was brought up was education in the African-American community, all communities, Hispanic alike, because then we got into the issue of class. But your thoughts on our current leadership addressing urban education in Texas?
Well, that gets into a whole nother subject. It's not. I think that the Republican leadership has been coasting on the Capitol that we built up a long time ago. A lot of it was due to Ronald Reagan, and also there's an absence of really addressing concerns of ordinary people. There's too much soundbite emphasis on press releases and talk about what you're going to do and all these great things, but there isn't real activity at the local level. That is, we showed what could be done. Quite frankly, we did it over the objection of Governor Rick Perry when he was governor, of a greater emphasis on vocational and technical education. And I work with many of the school leaders from around the country, around the state, and there's some really good men and women in those positions. There's some who are just bureaucrats, but there's some good people who really care about the kids. And I think we're not engaging in any of this. And we don't engage. I know up in Dallas, when I was active, we had we engaged with the black community and the Hispanic community, but it's just it's totally different now, and I don't like what I'm seeing. And the Democrats, on the other hand, they just pander, and it's like we've got the vote in the pocket, and so neither side is doing very much. But education is a huge issue. You
said earlier that you thought this was more of a class issue, but I don't see a lot of the Caucasian community out demonstrating and raising the roof. Yes.
Well, no, I'm saying it's a class problem in terms of the country, because you have the growing inequality and the decline of the middle class. You've got these Wall Street guys and these people that have shipped jobs overseas, and the private equity moguls who load companies up with tons of debt, and they don't care about if it doesn't work, they go on to the next deal.
So I think what I hear you saying is that because of those actions, it's disproportionately affecting the African American community already because of the issues we've talked about, which is the breakdown of education, lack of entrepreneurship, the family, the lack of faith. Okay. Your takeaway, Tom. What do you think?
I think the two gentlemen you have on your show said it before me. Teach a man to fish. Give a man a fish or teach a man to fish, and that's the Booker T. Washington creed, if you will. And then, and secondly, the importance of God. This country can't last unless it has a belief in God. You have this growing secularism and growing hedonism, and it's all about power. And there's a greater power, and that's got to be recognized. That is weakening in the black community as well as the white community, the faith of people. And that was one of the great strengths of the black community in the 50s, 60s, in a tough period.
Yeah, in urban areas, I will tell you that I'm somewhat surprised at the number of, I'm obviously Catholic, but the number of Catholic schools that are closing down for, and so, faith-based education is struggling as well. But
we need help with that.
Yeah. We had Our Mother Mercy had a very strong school, and it closed down several years ago.
Where was that
It
school?
was located in Fifth Ward. Yeah, it's the church that L. Franco Lee went to, and Harold attends now. So
when you say Harold Michael's referring to Harold Dutton, the state representative in Houston. Yeah,
right. And former Commissioner L. Franco Lee, who is deceased now.
And Mike, real quick, the Booker T. Washington Initiative is we are working with those based schools right now. Those who are closing, those that are on the verge of closing, we're reaching out to them, and then we're also bringing in the career technology education component. So this is a plug for the Booker T. Washington Initiative as their director with Texas Public Policy Foundation. We are working with those schools right now. We're partnering with those schools, and we're trying to make sure that we bring additional resources into those schools, and then also support legislation that will help the current Secretary of Education, because she's working with freedom of education, scholarships, and micro grants.
This is a sports station. This is ESPN 97.5 in Houston. If you want to call in or have a question in the last few minutes, the number is 713-780-3776, 713-780-3776. But speaking of sports, Michael and Richard, I don't know what's going on up in Dallas, but I have noticed back when I was a kid in the 60s, every playground was full. There was activities. I mean, you played Little League and you did fun football, and nowadays it's really difficult to find urban parks full of kids with organized activities where you have men coaching boys.
Well, one of the things, I had a meeting last Friday, and another concern of mine is that everybody now is throwing money out here. And I'm telling the locals to say, hey, you need to apply for that money, and making sure that all those athletes who give to those organizations that they know by name, but it's the folks that's in the community that really needs it. They don't have large fundraisers, but they have a passion to serve, like the Clint Johns, who's been working for probably 30 years without
Craven.
Yeah, Mr. Craven. And the reason why that's as important, like you say, that was a lady who mentioned that her daughter, who is a 5-time district champion coach over at Booker T. Washington with the volleyball, she's trying to do something inside the community.
I want to remind you of something, because I remember when we served on the Houston City Council back in the 1990s, President Clinton was the president of the United States, and the big deal was where some of the city council members almost lost it. Midnight basketball, right? They wanted recreation activities for the kids at the community centers. And there were those on council that thought, well, my God, it would have been the end of the world that we would provide some kind of supervised activity with male coaches for inner city kids. I mean, I look back at it, I'm just trying to think, well, gee, I hope I voted for that.
Orlando, one thing that we didn't have back in the 60s and the 70s when we were growing up, we didn't have cell phones.
Yeah.
We didn't have truancy.
Yeah.
We didn't have video games.
Yeah, well, I'm sure you guys are going to propose to take those forms of communications away from the kids. We're down to 2 minutes. Tom, what's it like up in the Metroplex? Are public parks full of kids engaged in activities in the urban area?
No.
Yeah, that's terrible. Well, look, we're down to our last minute. I wish we could do this more often, but this was very unique opportunity for us. Again, this program has been brought to you by the Texas Latino Conservatives. We are a nonprofit organization, but we're also a political action committee. And tonight we wanted to use the nonprofit side to talk about and educate the community about some of the activities going on in the state of Texas. And our guest this evening was former City Council member Michael Yarbrough, who represented District B, the 5th Ward of Houston, Texas, predominantly African American. His former Chief of Staff, Richard Johnson. Now we call him Dr. Johnson, a veteran of the United States Air Force. We thank you for your community involvement. We thank you for your involvement with the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And, of course, from Dallas, Texas, we were joined by former Republican Party Chairman Tom Pauken, a staff member for Ronald Reagan, and also worked for Rick Perry. I want to thank you, Tom, for your participation and taking time out of your evening to be with us.
Enjoyed it, Orlando.
All right. Well, we are down to our last 30 seconds. I want to remind everybody that if you want to follow the Texas Latino Conservatives, you can go to our website, which is www.texaslatinoconservatives.com. That's texaslatinoconservatives.com. You can follow us on Facebook, on Instagram. We have our own YouTube channel. So please drop us a line. Let us know what you thought about the program. Enjoy the rest of your your Sunday. God bless all of you, and pray for our country.
This presentation was presented commercial-free by the Texas Latino Conservatives. The views and opinions expressed in tonight's program do not represent those of ESPN 97.5, Gal Media, or their sponsors and partners.